Thank you so much. I am so honored to be able to present Peter for tonight's webinar, a true luminary in the field of educational leadership. Peter is so prolific and accomplished that it's impossible to state all of his achievements in a brief intro, but I will try my best. Many of you may know, but in case you don't, he was a K-5 teacher for 11 years and a principal for 8. He is currently a leadership coach who inspires leaders from all over the world, North America, Australia, Asia, to name a few continents. Yes, continents. He writes the Finding Common Ground column for Education Week. Also for Education Week, he's co-created a series called A Seat at the Table, which he moderates conversations on race and equity and gender, sexual orientation, and so much more. He hosts a podcast called Leaders Coaching Leaders. He's won a New York State Outstanding Educator of the Year award. And transitioning even closer to the topic at hand today, Peter is the author and co-author of over 8 books, beginning with his groundbreaking Dignity for All, Safeguarding LGBTQ Students. Much of his work focuses on leadership teams within schools and finding ways to make them more effective. And tonight's webinar will continue to shine a spotlight on this very important topic. So again, his book and the entire webinar called Collective Leader Efficacy, Strengthening Instructional Leadership Teams. I don't want to give too much away about the book. It's fabulous. I know you're going to read it, but be prepared to really hear about some key drivers that make teams more effective while also keeping in mind well-being and reasonable workloads for leaders. So I am so excited to turn it over to Peter today to really talk about this game-changing work on leader efficacy. So Peter, it's all yours.
All right, Tanya. Thank you, Tanya and Katie. Thank you so much. And Deanna, I just want to shout out that I saw your chat. You said great way to try to keep people engaged for the whole presentation to give that free giveaway. She said, beside, of course, an amazing presentation. So it's good to hear. Listen, we're gonna engage 2 ways, and I know it's going to be really quick because we have an hour together, or less than an hour, and there are over 1,700 of you that have registered for this. So thank you so much for that. I'm deeply honored. We're going to engage using a thing called Mentimeter. It is an online engagement tool, and if you look, and if you happen to have your phone, or you can actually open up a separate tab on your computer. If you go to www.menti.com and you use the code 8965-0498, we will be able to engage with each other. Let me just tell you something quick about Mentimeter. Number one, it is anonymous. So I am not going to know who's saying what, and I am trusting that we're going to have an amazing conversation. I am going to ask for your input on a few things. But secondly, you're not going to get any spam email from this. And one of the things that I love about Mentimeter is the fact that I use this remotely or in person. And the reason why is because I feel like it just helps people engage in deeper conversations. The second way we're going to engage is many of you are starting to sign in to Mentimeter, and you'll see that code at the top. That code is just for us, just for this session. But the other way we're going to engage with each other is through the chat box. And what I want you to know is that what I love about the chat box is that in the olden days, way before COVID, one of the things that happened is if you were having a sidebar conversation or workshop, I wouldn't necessarily be able to hear that, or at a keynote. But when we can do this remotely using the chat box, I can actually engage with you and see what you're thinking. So please make sure that you keep the chat box on fire. As Tanya said, I moderate a show called A Seat at the Table for Education Week, and I always have the chat box open because I'm looking for what the viewers are saying. So if you want to engage with me, if you want to engage with one another through the chat box, please continue to do that because I want to see what is resonating for you. So, Sharon, I do want to call out from the chat box that somebody joined me from the Gold Coast of Australia, and I said they need to invite me. I see you are from the Cayman Islands, so I'm looking for an invite. So that's all I'm saying. So if you feel like this is a really good presentation, just make sure you contact me. That's right, Carl. Mentimeter can allow for an equity of voice, and that's what I love, because all of this work is actually centered around making sure that we're lowering our status as maybe building leaders and raising the status of the people that are around us. And you're right, Adelaide is a great place to visit too. So please engage with me through Mentimeter or the chat box. Don't be shy. I have some success criteria for our time together, and this is also the success criteria from the book. This book, I'm very excited about. It came out a couple of weeks ago. It is a most comprehensive book that I have ever written before. And there are a few things. By the end of this presentation, you're going to be able to define collective leader efficacy. You're going to reflect on ways that you and your school leaders actually engage, develop CLE. You're going to be able to define some of the drivers for school leadership teams. And then we're going to talk about a cycle of inquiry, which many of you probably know a cycle of inquiry already, but I'm going to introduce one with just a couple of extra pieces in there. And I thought that it was really, really important. Thank you for making sure that the code for Mentimeter is in the chat box. I appreciate that. You will see that on most slides too. We're going to talk about making sure that we build coherence between our school leadership teams and what we practice in schools. Coherence, great book by Michael Fullen, is also something that we know sometimes we lack within our schools. And then last but not least is consider what your next steps are going to be. Now that's my success criteria. So for those of you that actually signed up for Mentimeter, I want to know what your success criteria is. What were you hoping when you signed up for this? When Corwin sent out the registration link and when I tweeted it out and sent it out through my newsletter and that kind of stuff, what were you thinking when you said, you know what, I really want to be a part of that webinar? So what is your success criteria for our time together? Very good. Thank you for the first person putting it in. Like I said, it is anonymous when you're using it, and I am going to try to keep track because they're going to flow in. How to support teachers as leaders. Absolutely. A warm up for North Carolina. Very good plug for a conference that I'm going to be giving a keynote at next month to learn ways to help our teachers through this year, strategies for building capacity and staff as shared leaders. I will be better equipped to get my team up and about. I want to learn how to further develop myself as a leader. Absolutely. And I'm going to try to fly through some of these. I will find 1 to 2 strategies that I can utilize to increase the efficacy of my team. I'm going to stop right there because that's an important one. What I want you to keep in mind is this. I love that you want to come and you want to learn about different strategies, but here are a couple of things that I also want you to keep in mind. Don't just easily accept the strategies that I'm giving you. Think about the strategies that you're already using in school, because I bet you that they can be just as deep and profound as maybe some of the strategies that I am offering. In fact, one place during this presentation, I'm going to talk about de-implementation. So you're going to see why I'm saying that, but thank you for putting that in there. I'm always interested in hearing from others, getting different voices into that room. That's right. Build a stronger team. 1 to 3 key strategies to share with school leaders, cooperation, receive validation. That's awesome for things that I do that I already know and do. Absolutely, because I want you to keep in mind, think about how this connects with the practices that you're already engaged in. Daniel, my principal recently completed a master's in instructional leadership with 1 subject with Hattie. I'm interested in learning more about instructional leadership to understand how to best collaborate. All right, absolutely. Deepen my understanding of successful collaboration components, strengthening our exec team, how to become a stronger leader. These are awesome. They are flying in too. You have so far 128 of you. This is great. How to support teachers and leaders, be a better leader, strengthen my leadership capacity. This is awesome. Thank you. Reflect on my own practice. It's so technically, for those of you that wrote, it's Hattie's #1 effect on student outcomes. That's collective teacher efficacy. This is collective leader efficacy, and I'm going to talk about why that's different. So thank you for being able to put that in. I'm going to give about 10 more seconds, and then I'm going to move on. Inspiration. You know what? I am going to try my best to make sure that I offer you that, because I know things are difficult. I actually coach school leadership teams in different parts of the country, and I was in California and Washington State last week. Being in schools, I understand that it is very difficult and challenging. I actually have a remote on-demand course through Thinkific that gives people access for 13 months. So I have mastery sessions every 3 weeks with people taking my coaching courses, instructional coaches and leadership coaches. So inspiration is something that we definitely focus on because you definitely need it. All right. How to improve my leadership capacity. All right. Thank you so much. And LaDonna, I see shared responsibility. So let's move on. A couple of things we have to keep in mind, and this is really hard because what we have to understand is that our schools are learning organizations. There's a descriptive strand where we talk about how learning organizations learn and adapt together. That's something I'm going to focus on. But there's a normative strand, which we're a learning organization. It's not just about that we are helping students learn, although highly important. We also have to keep in mind that we're a learning organization because how we come together as adults and learn. And sometimes things take us away from that. I remember you mentioned John Hattie. John wrote this really great paper. It was the first paper he ever asked me to edit, and it was called The Politics of Distraction. And he said, far too often we talk about adult issues, we don't talk enough about learning. So we have to keep in mind that we are a learning organization. And if you see Robinson's name at the bottom, that's Vivian Robinson. If you don't know her work, you should, because she's absolutely amazing. Wrote a really good book called Student-Centered Leadership. Thanks, Lynn. I love her work too. So who is your building leadership, your school leadership team? That's going to depend. You know, sometimes in Australia it might look different depending on the size of your school, right? If you're K-12, depending on the population, you might have a building leader, or if you're in the UK, you know, right, you might have a head teacher, right? Or assistant principals or instructional coaches, teacher leaders. My instructional leadership team, my school leadership team, which used to be called the Principals Advisory Council, was me, along with 2 co-chairs who were the union reps, and then grade level representatives from each grade level. I didn't have assistant principals. So that's going to look different depending on your team. But what I want you to think about, for those of you looking at maybe, do you want to twist on the roles? One of the things that I've been looking at is the fact that when I'm working with school leadership teams, I will sometimes show up to the school leadership team with teachers and instructional coaches and building principals. And then I ask them about their specific roles. What is your specific role on the team? And more times than not, they don't have one. In fact, I remember being in Massachusetts one time, meeting with a group, a high school leadership team. And when I asked them why they were a part of this group and what they focus on, there were people that were on for 2 years that said, I don't have a specific role. So what I was thinking about is that if we really want to look at us as a learning organization, then one of the things that I definitely focus on in the book is about, what about roles that you can have, right? And the roles are things like co-chairs. For my school leadership team meeting, I never ran the meeting. I had the co-chairs do it, because one of the things that we know is that if we're a school principal, we might have status because we're the only one, right? We're the only school principal maybe in our school. What we want to do is lower our status and raise the status of the people around us. So for those of you that are looking at creating more teacher leadership, then help them become the co-chairs. What about a facilitator of learning? I used to flip my faculty meetings. And this is something I'll talk about in a couple of minutes as well. But what about that facilitator of learning at your instructional leadership team meeting, or school-based team, or within your faculty meeting? Who's facilitating the learning? How are the adults learning together? Too often what happens is adults get together and they just read through an agenda. We need to be engaged in learning. For a school leadership team, it's a really great place for somebody to have a facilitator of learning. Visual representation. I was just talking to somebody who is an instructional coach in the coaching course that I teach through Thinkific, and she was talking about the fact that they're collecting evidence that kids are able to do sketchnoting. You know, sketchnoting is not just something that looks pretty. It actually is a sort of this mind map of what people are picking up from the meeting that can really be great formative assessment. We might have somebody who's a researcher. I do a lot of research and reading research, and it's something that I love, but I'm not the only one. There might be somebody that, if you're talking about an instructional strategies to be able to use at your school, you might have somebody that actually engages in being a research. I was actually just reading a research paper today. I swear, Monday morning, I was reading research on neuromyths. It's from the School of Psychology from Canada. And one of the things they talk about is they actually said that research found that just when publishers put a picture of a brain, people think that it's actually authentic, and they're going to pick that more than they would just pick a narrative. So what that shows is that we need somebody who can do research. If you're going to do an initiative in school, if you're going to follow an initiative or implement a strategy, have somebody research it. Note taker, it's old school, but it's good, because what happens is you've got somebody who's actually taking notes, and then they send it out 24 hours later, and that keeps everybody in the school informed. Critical friend, somebody who's going to give me the opposite opinion. My co-chairs were my union reps, and very often they were people that thought differently than me, and that was good, because I didn't walk into a meeting with one idea, wanting to walk out with the same one. I walked into a meeting with one idea, wanting to walk out with a different one because of the people around the table. And then innovator. I know that some of you are from New Brunswick in Canada, and thank you for being here, because you guys were the ones that months ago, when I was doing this presentation for your school board, I said, what's missing? And they said, innovator. This is a person that doesn't just see what is, they see all the possibilities of what could be. And I definitely added it to the roles, and I cited you in the book as well. So these are just things. Oh, Carl, I like that. A data manager is another important role, right? Carl, where were you, right? A couple of months ago. So yeah, that's something that's really important as well. So think about roles. And even in the book, I say, what are some roles that you would add to the list that I've got? Roles are important. And I see things, time manager. I love some of these that I see coming up in the chat box. Please keep sharing them. What I want to do is be able to share with you briefly, because this is an overview, right? The whole idea of collective leader efficacy. Some of you mentioned collective teacher efficacy being the #1 impact for John when he used to rank them from 1 to 251. What I always felt when I was reading it, and I added collective teacher efficacy into my book on collaborative leadership and instructional leadership, because I think collective teacher efficacy is really important. But one of the things that I noticed is that the principle sets up the opportunity for teachers to engage with one another. Super important. But I kept thinking about, I want more, because as a principal, I went directly from teaching in a high poverty city school to being a principal in a rural suburban school. And one of the things I did is I went to every classroom every morning and say good morning to the kids. They called it my morning rounds. And then what I would do is go back into the classrooms at different times in the day. And I tried to make sure I was doing this on a daily basis. I want more than just being the person who sets up the opportunity. I want to be a part of the conversation. If we are second in Ken Leithwood's work, second to teachers on impacting student learning, then shouldn't we have more of a role? So collective leader efficacy is how we have the shared conviction that our school leadership team can make a significant contribution in raising student achievement, but also impacting growth. This is from an article that Jenny Donahue and I wrote many months ago. Jenny does fantastic work when it comes to collective teacher efficacy. The thing that makes collective leader efficacy a little bit more difficult is the fact that principals often have status. Quickly, I want to share why I say that. I used to give new kids in the school a tour around my building. And one of the things, I would give a tour around our building, and the parents were always there. We'd come back to the office, and I would have parents more times than not say, I never want you to have to come back here. And I was like, please don't say that. I see kids for good reasons more than I see them for bad reasons. And what I realized is even my office had status. So that flipped my thinking. And I started saying, when I'm doing formal teacher observations, like the post or pre or post observation, I need to do it down in their classroom, because I'm doing it in my office where my office has status. And I want to make sure that I'm actually bringing it to a space where they feel comfortable. So this whole idea of collective leader efficacy is about building that shared conviction, but also understanding that some of us might have more status than others. And Yolanda, I see that you need someone who has a special education background for those identified and unidentified. And I completely agree with you. And I sort of had an assumption there, right? That most teams would have that. Just so you know, one of my co-chairs was actually the self-contained teacher. So I absolutely had that. Elena, does this construct apply to leaders who regularly collaborate across a district or region on problems of practice? Yes, It absolutely does, because I'm actually working, I'm doing state work in Washington State with Mike Nelson and Chris Beals and Todd Murphy from WASA, the Washington Association of School Administrators. And I'm going through developing this right now with regional leaders and district leaders as well. Absolutely. So thank you for that. Where this also comes from, some of you were looking for inspiration. I want to give you a little inspiration. In order to have inspiration, in order to build a motivation, Ken Leithwood, who actually gave me great feedback on this book, said motivation comes from having a sense of agency, and that comes from two places: capacity beliefs and context beliefs. Capacity beliefs is self-efficacy. Do I have confidence in my own actions? And self-efficacy is context specific. We have areas where we feel confident, areas where we don't. So that's one side of it. Do I feel confident to be here? Context beliefs is whether I work in a school that's going to support that kind of work. That's what comes together when I'm going to introduce you to drivers. Because believe it or not, as much as we may have collaborated all over the place, is the fact that when we're talking about collaboration, one of the things that happens is people don't feel comfortable collaborating. Dania, wondering, is this collective efficacy another way of stating what Rick Dufour shared via? No, so it is different. It is not the same. And the reason why it's different is a couple of reasons, Dania, and I'm glad you asked that question. So there's research from Boston consulting firm, Andy Hargraves and Michael O'Connor actually wrote about this. And they found that PLCs were the most beloved form of professional learning on the part of administrators. They loved that teachers engaged in professional learning communities. But when they actually surveyed teachers, PLCs were the most hated form of professional learning on the part of teachers because they found it to be contrived collaboration. So the reason why this is a little bit different, and I like that question, is a couple of things. PLCs typically don't have principals who are a part of it. It's typically teacher-based, and that would be collective teacher efficacy. That would be the researchy way of looking at PLCs with collective teacher efficacy. Collective leader efficacy is going to be when you've got those school-based teams. They don't typically consider themselves PLCs. And one of the really important things that we have to look at when it comes from that research around PLCs, and I love the idea of PLCs, what we have to look at from that research is that part that Andy Hargraves and Michael O'Connor talked about. Is it considered contrived collaboration? And quite honestly, school-based teams have been that too. It's kind of like window dressing sometimes, that we feel like we're a part of it. I told you already about lowering our status and raising the status of the people around us, right? And that's why instead of this hierarchy with instructional leader or instructional coach or school leader, it's about how can we be more holistic. And Dania, yeah, real PLCs, unfortunately, what happens with PLCs is it's still based as far as teachers are concerned and not necessarily a school leader being a part of it. So what we're looking at is this more holistic picture of making sure that we're having that shared work. So what happens is that when we're looking at how collective leader efficacy comes together, I needed to be able to look at the drivers that actually drive our collective efforts. These drivers are based on a couple of things. Number one, they're going to be based on Michael Fullin's research. And number two, and Michael actually wrote the foreword for the book. And number two, they're completely tied to Bandura's work around the 4 experiences that actually help raise our sense of efficacy. So you're going to go through 8 drivers, albeit really quick. And what we're going to see is that these are all related to Bandura's 4 experiences, which is a mastery experience, a vicarious experience, social persuasion, and effective states. So let's start with the research first. Drivers comes from Michael Fullin's work, right? So you can see fostering intrinsic motivation. You can see engaging educators and continuous improvement. You can see the whole idea of inspiring collective or teamwork, and then it impacts teachers and students 100%. So number one, and Ken Leithwood gave me great research or great feedback, because he actually said when we were going back and forth, why didn't you use all the original drivers from the collective leader efficacy research that he had done. And the reason why is because I feel like over the past year and a half, our perspectives and our needs have changed. So you're going to see a few of these that are brand new introductions into the research, and I'll highlight what those are. And then I'm going to call out the ones that Ken Leithwood has actually offered and John Hattie, okay? Number one is mindset. One of the things that we've heard for the past year and a half, and media was definitely all about it, was they kept talking about COVID learning loss. And there are a lot of researchers, and I interviewed them on a seat at the table for Education Week, that have said there isn't COVID learning loss. They didn't lose anything. We have to start looking at what did they learn over that past year and a half, because they didn't stop learning, right? So one of the things that we have to be able to do with mindset is we have to change that deficit mindset, because that's what I'm concerned about. And quite honestly, we have a deficit mindset when it comes to things like race and gender. So mindset is really about making sure that we're having that growth mindset that people like Carol Dweck has talked about. Carol actually gave a testimonial for the book, but also Ryan Smith, a predisposition to see the world in a particular way, a filter through which we look at the world. Some of you are looking for inspiration. It's really important when we talk about mindset, because mindset is about, I just recently was working with a school district that have a morale issue. And the problem is when you've got a morale issue, what that shows is that people instantly think, well, the school principal is the one in control of morale. No, we all are. So mindset is about understanding that we all contribute negatively or positively to our school climate. So instead of focusing on things like change, we need to focus on improvement. Instead of feeling improvement in our gut, we have to collect evidence to understand our impact. And I want you to take a moment to just read through a couple of those as I take a sip of water. And I want to call out some of the chat. Aaron, I say you could move away from the contrived feeling and perspective by having the team set a goal on how they will get together. Aaron, if you remember, if you were here at the beginning of this presentation, I showed you my success criteria, and then I asked you for your success criteria. So when I'm working with groups, whether it's workshops, keynotes, or coaching, we develop success criteria together. So you're absolutely correct that is a really important part to be able to look at. The second driver is well-being. Now, I have been focusing on well-being. I was hired from EdWeek 10 years ago to start writing about social emotional learning. And it's been a staple of the blogs that I have posted. Well-being is very important, but lately there's been this criticism that well-being is about breathing. Now, I'm a practitioner of meditation. I practice meditation every morning. But it's more than just breathing. I mean, yes, meditation can help me. It has helped me learn how to react to those things that I don't control because I'm a control freak. But well-being is also about understanding what do we have to do differently within our practices? Because using the same workload and then telling people to breathe, that's not going to help. So you're going to see that these drivers are actually interrelated. All right. So the whole idea of well-being is about this idea of how is it that we are actually paying attention to the well-being of the people around the table and within our school. It's about setting boundaries, right? Because we are terrible. We check email all the time. We do emails on Saturdays and Sundays. People go into work on Sundays. Well-being is about setting boundaries, but it's also about how we talk with one another within our group. So you're going to see how some of these are interrelated, but I want to hear from you. What is the most important aspect to committing to well-being as a team? Like, what do you think of when you think about well-being? What is one of the most important aspects that you have created to commit to well-being as a team? You can do it in your chat box, or you can do it on Mentimeter. And yes, so Cindy, I'm seeing empathy. Danya, I'm seeing listening to respond to listening to understand. Absolutely. Not only is that a great Stephen Covey quote, but also there's a fantastic TED Talk from Celeste Headley on 10 ways to have a better conversation. I have seen it well over 100 times because I used to use it in my workshop. So Celeste Headley, 10 ways to have a better conversation, definitely a great thing. And I actually talk about it in the book as well. See each other as human first. Absolutely. It's okay to pause. Authenticity, knowing individual teams members' strengths. Absolutely. We're going to talk about that. Trust. Seeing others as people and not objects. And also much to that, I used to find that when I was a school principal within our district, there were times that if a teacher was on board, they were the greatest teacher in the world. But when they weren't on board, they were actually vilified. So it's that kind of behavior that we have to look at as well. And I see, Amanda, you said treat each other respectfully, right? So absolutely allowing people to work with their strengths. Holding each other up when times are rough. Jennifer Lopez, you're here. I am so excited. Trust and accountability. Absolutely. I'm sure you've probably heard that before too. Positive interventions. We're trying an actual lunch break in our team. Yes. Being able to eat and go to the bathroom all in the same time. Well, not at the same time, sorry, but all in the same, prep time and those kind of things. We're collaboration, not just cooperation, right? Building community, checking in with staff. Yes, absolutely. Valuing everyone's time, being clear. A positive well-being is directly related to amount of time, for sure. Having fun and laughter. Starbucks, I love that. Carla, I'm seeing your comment about screenshots. I would try my best, but screenshots can be very difficult. But you know what? If you contact me, I'll give you my email address at the end. We can figure something out. Tim Hortons, I just saw that. Number 3 on the list is professional learning and development. This is something that I read a paper from Michael Fullen and Andy Hargraves about 4 years ago that they wrote for Learning Forward. And it was so wonderful. Because what they say is professional learning is a lot like student learning, where we're talking about outcomes. Professional development is where we're focusing on mindfulness and well-being and team building. That was so beautiful when I read it. And I thought that is an important part of the team, because when I had my principal's advisory council, we would sit there and we would focus on well-being. We would focus on team building. I don't like when things are necessarily called training, because I feel like training now, and maybe we need to take the word back. Training is sometimes like we're sitting there and it's all compliance based, right? And I was so tired of that when I was a teacher and a school principal. Professional learning development is what we have to engage in when we're in our school-based team or our faculty meetings. One of the things that I focus on within the book is a topic that I've talked about a lot, which is that idea of flipped leadership. I did flipped faculty meetings. My staff talked to me about what they wanted to learn together. So I found an article that I would send out a few days before the faculty meeting, and then they would bring evidence of how they put those things into practice, like feedback or an instructional strategy, evidence-based observation. So professional learning and development has to be a strong core of our team, because it's about how we learn together, and that flipped process can absolutely help. And I will definitely share these slides with Corwin after I'm done, so then they can take care of that, okay? Yeah, Natasha, training is limited within the moment and really transfers to the classroom, right? And that's something we have to think about, and you're gonna see me talk about that in just a minute. Yes, Carla, training and staff development is done unto you, and that's what I don't want. I want conversation, and that's why I use Mentimeter, both in person and remote. Now, the number 4 driver that I added is from Ken Leithwood. Yes, the citation is from Jan because it's from 2020, but working conditions was something that Ken Leithwood absolutely looked at. So working conditions are things like job benefits and workload and school disciplinary environment. They actually found in research that if principals entered into a school that had a high discipline issue, they were more likely to leave the school. And the one thing that I want to say about collective leader efficacy is Education Week actually did a recent study to show that 92% of teachers that were surveyed said that they are more stressed now than they ever were before, including in the first year of COVID. Where we also know is NASSP and LPI, Learning Policy Institute, actually did a study that showed that 42% of principals have indicated that they would consider leaving their job. So working conditions, remember at the driver when I talked about well-being, working conditions is completely interrelated to this, because what we have to look at is, why are we doing what we're doing? Now, some of you in that slide on Mentimeter talked about job benefits and you didn't even know it, because job benefits are not just about pay, although highly important. It's also about the bennies of being in our school. Like, I worked for a principal that was pretty miserable, and she used to make our life pretty miserable every day. And then I went directly to being a principal, and I realized I had to start off by every day by trying to get people to smile when they came through the main office. That's why I visited every classroom every morning. Some of you are asking about more time talking about flipped faculty meetings. One of the things that happened for me is the working conditions. Teachers felt like they didn't have a voice in their own learning, because regionally and statewide, and I was a principal in New York State, they always felt like it was compliance-based, and it was. So one of the things that I said is, we can control the learning within our school. Let's build the success criteria of what we want to learn together. And we started off by talking about feedback. And this was 10 years ago. And I found a great article by Grant Wiggins. And I sent that out about 3 days before the faculty meeting. That's what the flipped process is, because self-efficacy means that people don't necessarily have confidence in the very thing you might have confidence in. So flipping the process gives them the opportunity to read something so they can gain some confidence before coming in. How cool is it? We actually flipped our parent communication. I would create these videos to send out before open house or PTA and say, this is what we're going to be focusing on. Come with questions. We flipped our report card process. We sent the report cards home a week early with possible questions they could ask their child's teacher. So that's a part of it. Working conditions means that we have to change the working conditions we might be used to, right? So what this means also is that we have to engage in a practice which is called de-implementation. And I talk about this, I wrote about this in the book, but it's also a topic that I'm spending more time talking about. It comes from the medical field. De-implementation is a process of abandoning existing low-value practices. It needs to be evidence-based. Some people get very angry with me, especially administrators. They're like, you can't tell people that, they're just going to get rid of stuff. No. De-implementation has to be based on evidence. You can't just get rid of stuff you don't like. And it's about looking at the initiatives that we engage in. Do we need to engage in all of these initiatives? What are strategies that we're using in the classroom that we might not need to use, right? So de-implementation is the process of abandoning low-value practices. What are low-value practices? This comes from Canadian Journal of School Psychology. And what they found is low-value practices are things that have been shown to not be efficacious or effective, or they're less effective, or they might cause harm, or that are no longer necessary. Make no mistake, I am spending 2 minutes talking about de-implementation, but this is a huge topic. And I've written some blogs that you can find on Finding Common Ground about decluttering our practices. But low-value practices, it takes our school leadership team or your PLCs to get together to talk about not only implementing something new, but what could we de-implement as well. And this is completely tied to well-being as well, because what I think is it's more than just breathing, right? It's more than just 10 minutes of breathing in the morning. It's about the fact that we need to start taking things off of our plate, right? So Terry, Terry, so good to see you in here. Thank you. Yes, deliberate abandonment. I am focusing on this more and more. I've actually talked about it. I have a YouTube channel that you can go to, and I talk about it, and I have articles that are in there as well, right? The next one is organizational commitment. This is another one of Ken Leithwood's. And Ken was talking about organizational commitment. What are we committed to as an organization? And I wanted to help expand on that. Not only what are we committed to as an organization, which should be focused on student learning, not adults and politics, but it's also about how is our organization committed to us? They can't just keep piling stuff on. We have to make sure that they're taking stuff off as well. And then last but not least, is the idea of how are we committed to our organization? How are we committed to our organization? All right. So, Dania, yeah, like Hattie says, almost all change is good for some students or we would not implement it. The question is what change makes the biggest change in the success of each student? And that's where we have to make sure that we're looking at something like de-implementation. Adriana, thank you for being here. This is the most respectful thing we can do for teachers right now, abandon what isn't working. Absolutely. And I see Linda, organized abandonment, Peter Drucker, absolutely. You know, it's really interesting though, because when you're looking specifically for de-implementation, it doesn't necessarily come up. It comes up in the medical research from 2017 on, but it also comes up in just over the past 2 years from school psychology. But like I said, make sure that you understand it is evidence-based. Organizational commitment. What are we committed to as an organization, right? Then we have context beliefs. And you already saw a bit of this. And this comes from Ken Leithwood. Do we actually work in a school where we feel like we're going to be supported? And you will be surprised when you're finding the book that people don't feel supported. And sometimes it's just a miscommunication. So it's really about looking at how we're communicating with one another, which is what you'll see in the next couple of drivers. But there's a discrepancy between what teachers feel and what students feel, and what leaders feel and what teachers feel. Sometimes leaders think they are doing the very thing that's supposed to support their teachers, and teachers don't feel supported at all. I heard this one story one time about how a teacher or a principal actually bought his whole entire staff a book on collective teacher efficacy, handed it out on the first day of school and said, read it, and in a week come back with a goal. Now, he thought he was being supportive because collective teacher efficacy, all the rage. The teachers were looking, going, what? We have to read a book in the first week of school and come back with a goal? So sometimes our efforts do not match up with what real support looks like. So context beliefs is really important. Now, this is something I worked on with Hattie. John looked at it from a student collective. I looked at it from the adult collective. So I added some pieces from the research. This is not necessarily John's part is the skills. He said, Peter, look at the skills to work in collectives. What I added was the different skills that we need. And this is where I, in the book, talk about things like Celeste Headley's work on 10 ways to have a better conversation. Number one, it's the emotional intelligence of the team. And I cite so many. I love that you're putting in Peter Drucker and you do Dufour and John Hattie and Vivian. And I talked about Vivian Robinson. I think it's always important that we understand we stand on the shoulders of giants. So there's some great work around building the emotional intelligence of our group, but it's also about how we communicate with one another. But it's also about the social sensitivity, which is how do people understand our communication? I used to think that I differentiated my instruction for the teachers just like I did for my students when I was a teacher for 11 years. It's about how do we actually differentiate the way we communicate with people, right? And then we build the ability to contribute to the collective responsibility. And we build that confidence and the ability to contribute ideas. What this all leads to is the confidence to work in collectives. And I'm going to end the same way I started, because I told you that all 8 drivers are tied to the amazing research and impactful research of Albert Bandura. The confidence to work in collectives, we build that through 4 experiences: mastery, vicarious, how we learn from one another, how we talk with one another, verbal persuasion, social influences, and physiological and affective states, which is how do we create a psychologically safe place for the people around that table and within our schools. This is what I need from you. Talk through them super quick, and we have one part to go. But where is your team when it comes to these? So I talked about all of these 8, right? So where is your team right now? When you think about your school-based team, where are you? Maybe you're a teacher sitting on the school-based team. Maybe you're a principal. Where are you when it comes to mindset and well-being and professional learning and development? Where are you with these? I'm going to give about 30 to 40 seconds. Yes, Elena, can't forget Brene Brown's work on Dare to Lead. Absolutely, and being vulnerable, right? So thank you for that. Linda, I'm glad you liked that slide. I'm not sure if it's this one or the one I had up before, but I'm glad. And then Dana, love this star. Okay, I'm not sure what star that is, but I'm sure I'm missing out on something, but thank you. I'm glad you love whatever it is that you're seeing because this is important. So I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds, and that's teacher 10 seconds. So it really means about 30 seconds, right? All right. And I'm going to, while you're doing this, I'm going to shout out in the chat box. This year I work with principals and I hear the difficulty teachers are having working in groups, communicating, feeling safe. Yeah, it's, and we can see the polarization that happens outside of schools. And sometimes that plays inside of school. In fact, while I was writing this book, I got a tweet about what do you do when you've got that polarization, right? So I was writing a bit about that within the book. I'm so glad I got that tweet because it helps shape part of what I was writing within the book. Elena, is there a validated instrument that measures collective leader efficacy? All I can say is working on it. And just so you know, all 8 drivers have been vetted. So not only do I cite research, but actually all of the researchers are my litmus tests. So they're the ones who read the book before it ever comes out. But like I said, Elena, earlier, these 8 drivers that you just saw are completely tied to Bandura's research. So that's one of the ways that we tie it into. But the other thing I am working on right now with a friend of mine in Australia is that we're actually working on the validated instrument about what we can do next with this work. All right. So thank you for that. Oh, okay. Patricia, the star is from the skills to work in collectives. The arrow creates a star. So cool. Okay. Yes. Sorry. It's, almost my bedtime here on the East Coast. So thank you for putting these in. And thank you for all of your comments. And I like how Dana and Patricia are tag teaming. So practice. One of the things that I want to know is, what is your team focused on right now? So when you're hearing about this work and you're like, okay, I'm going to walk away, I need to process what Peter was talking about. Where would you be able to use this work? What are you focused on? Student success, okay? And let's see if anybody can get really, really deeply intentional in what they're saying. But I'd love to know, what are you focused on as a team? I see one so far. Okay. Oh, how to develop their goals. Absolutely. That's something I'm working on in my Thinkific on-demand course as well with leadership coaches. Better use of team meetings. Absolutely. That's why that flipped process, honestly, came out of a need because I had been a principal for about 5 years, but it wasn't until we did an activity as a principal's advisory council where I did this activity to engage them in what does low morale mean? And we got to this place where they talked about how they didn't feel like they had a voice in their own learning. That's when I started flipping. So this is what I want you to know. Some of the best ideas in your leadership, teacher leadership, instructional coaching leadership, administration leadership, some of the best ideas can come from the spots where you actually feel the most, I don't want to say stressed out, but when the work is the hardest, sometimes that's when you're more creative. Let's see, Carolina, don't you think that it is also important for leaders to be involved in teaching so that they can truly understand the teacher role? Yes, I will say that I do have a friend though that was a school psychologist, and he's worked really hard at understanding the teacher role. But I interviewed in front of a panel of 17, and they really wanted me to be their principal because I was coming from the classroom. So, I mean, I think you can find people, Carolina, that might think differently than that too. Changing our mindset. 3 things: simplicity, focus, celebrate, and growth. And then compliance, but need to change the focus. Okay, so cycle of inquiry. It's been around for many years. And cycles can sometimes start with that inquire part, which is sort of the third that you see there. I want to be perfectly honest with why I was so intentional to do it this way. Sometimes when I'm working with school districts on initiatives or school-based teams, they sort of jump into the work. And sometimes that's because they saw it on Pinterest, they saw it on social media and Twitter. Other times it's because it was packaged really nicely. And some of you actually wrote at the beginning of this in your success criteria that you wanted to learn some new strategies. And here's the thing. In order to engage in a cycle of inquiry, you have to develop a more intentional place of where you want to start. And in the book, I use a program logic model, that kind of stuff, but it's about those intentional conversations to talk about what that problem, right, that you're trying to solve, or the why that Simon Sinek talks about. But develop an understanding of where you want to start, and then explore how that work is being done already. And the reason why I say this is because too often people jump into work, and sometimes teachers are made to feel like this new initiative's coming in and teachers never did this work before. And that's just not true. Even with some of you in the chat box, you can see how this work is related to other work. It's about exploring. If you're going to develop this area to start, then start exploring how that work is being done already. Most times I hear it's being done in pockets, right? Just with PLCs. We have really great PLCs, but it's done in pockets. It's at this grade level or this department. So explore how this work is being done already, and then you start to inquire. So I'm going to just show you the slides that correspond with this. Number one, develop an understanding of the focus. I'm working with school leadership teams right now on English language learners, or they've seen an increase in the students receiving special education, or they've seen an increase. Tom Gusky talked to me about this, an increase in students receiving more than an F or an F in more than one subject. But I'm also working on de-implementation. And that is the last one that you see there. So develop an understanding of where you want to start. Explore how this work is being done already, because I swear to you, this is happening within your school. It's about expanding on it. All right. And Gabby, I'm looking at how do you get the start with staff? There are a lot of ways. You know, first of all, it's got to be about making sure that you've got that school-based team where you're looking at the drivers that I just talked about. At the same time, and I see some of you, Charlene, you put street data. Yeah, it's starting with the evidence. We often know where we're supposed to start our focus. We just don't always choose to do that. And, you know, Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry wrote a great book with Cheryl Ward that I read, I think it was like 8 years ago, that they said schools are awash with data, but we don't often do anything with it because we just have too much. So we often know where we need to start. Inquiry is where we develop a purpose statement. The purpose of this inquiry is, this is something that's widely done in Canada, which I love. I do a lot of work in Canada. So the purpose statement is the purpose of this inquiry. And that means you're very, very intentional because you did the develop, you explored how the work is being done, and then you start to develop an inquiry question and a theory of action. A theory of action, and I use one that Jenny Donahue shared with me. A theory of action is, if we do this, then this is what we think will happen, right? And that theory of action is something that drives our team. So some of you, Gina, yeah, Canada, absolutely. And the thing is that when you're going through this work and develop that understanding, especially Gabby, when you're talking about where do we start by having the conversation about developing, right? And then next, we're going to be able to plan. So Sean, let's see. How do you, because I see people cheering you, how do you prioritize what to do when everything feels like a priority without operating on a flavor of the month, a year model, but build sustainable practices? You're absolutely right. And it's about making sure, Sean, and I know that this is going to sound really simple, but sometimes I'm working in districts that they've got curriculum meetings or they've got school-based teams, and every month it's a different topic. I think what I did when it came to prioritizing is, even when I was flipping faculty meetings, it didn't mean that I flipped the whole meeting. It meant that maybe we spent 15 minutes talking about the priorities that are coming up, the stressors that are coming up, and then we continue the rest of the time making sure that we're completely focused on that area that we want to focus on. Or, Sean, another way to answer that question is, sometimes when we're in it, we can be myopic and we don't see that light at the end of the tunnel. And one of the things that I find is that sometimes we're after 8 different initiatives, but they do interconnect, but people don't always see how they interconnect. And that's why the implementation and de-implementation process is so important. In fact, with plan, Sean, this might be something that helps you as well. And I'm going to get into that in a minute. Terry, Most districts commit random acts of improvement and things are not done systemic and systematic. Absolutely, Terry. And that's something that we need to make sure that we focus on. And so program logic model is a way to be able to look at this as well. And this will answer some of the questions like Sean that you're having. When we develop a theory of action, we put that, and I know that I have 3 here, but we develop that theory of action. Just say you have one theory of action, then you start talking about the resources, then you start aligning the activities. That's something I'm doing right now. And then you focus on a timetable, and you also talk about what is the positive impact that teachers and this will have on teachers and students. If it's not going to have a positive impact, you shouldn't be engaging in it. So one of the things that I've done with districts is I've actually gone through these areas where they have like 8 initiatives. And when we get to impact, I had one district where they said, wow, we can't think of any impact. And I said, yeah, you're activity rich and impact poor. And I wrote a blog called You're Activity Rich and Impact Poor. And yeah, Dan, absolutely backwards design, right? That's a part of it. Because not only can you start with theory of action, but you can also, and not everybody does backwards design, but the impact, often what you can do is you develop that theory of action, and then you go to impact, right? And you talk about how is this theory of action actually going to have an impact? And how is that going to help benefit students? So you're absolutely right. Backward design, absolutely a part of this. What we also have to add in are those drivers that I introduced before, right? Because we can often engage in backwards design, but if it's dominated by one person around the team, then it's not going to work. And yeah, I wrote about a book or wrote a blog. I don't want to tell Tanya I wrote a book, Activity Rich and Impact Poor. And then we go into implementation, and that's part of those activities, right? How are we implementing these? What does that look like? I'm always going back to the same places: faculty meetings, school-based teams, PLCs, because formal observations, learning walks and walkthroughs, those are the places where we have to build, as Michael Folan says, coherence. And it's about bringing these things together. But sometimes it means we have to step back and see how these different initiatives are interconnected. At the same time, we might want to be able to de-implement them at the same time we implement. And then, of course, together we reflect on evidence. And I know that some of you actually said earlier something about the students. So yeah, one of the things that I work on with school leaders is, Tom Gusky gave me some really important information many years ago. He said, in order to build efficacy, what we have to do is we have to make sure we have a protocol in place. We have to use evidence teachers trust, and we have to make sure it makes a difference within weeks and not months. And so what we look at is, what is a leadership piece of evidence? Because I do a lot of competency-based workshops. What evidence would a leader bring? What evidence would a teacher bring? And what evidence would a student bring? As a principal, we used to do student-led conferences in our school. So we know kids at a very young age can actually do this. And Dana, I know we have so many young school leaders who have no background on change and school improvement. And they can't have a recipe. And yeah, you know what? Part of it is that we're responsible for that too. And last but not least, it's not just about the evidence we bring, it's about the conversation we have. When I engage in center-based learning or cooperative learning and workshops, I love hearing the conversations on the part of people. So this was my success criteria at the beginning: define collective leader efficacy, reflect on ways, define the drivers, right? And then consider how we can build coherence. And then this is what I would like to be able to do. Thank you, first of all. This is a QR code to a newsletter that I put out on a monthly basis. I put out research. I put out links to my Corwin podcast called Leaders Coaching Leaders, the show with Education Week, A Seat at the Table, Finding Common Ground, the Thinkific courses. My email address is here as well. Thank you for all of the comments within this. And I love the different chat and the citations that people can look at as well. And well, Katie, I am going to leave it over to you. All right.
All right. Thank you.